First of all, I think the court, once again, stood tall for the rule of international law, and particularly as it affects the state of Palestine and the Palestinian people. We have to see this opinion, historic opinion, as twinned with the perhaps even more historic opinion that the court issued last year, when it found that the entire Israeli occupation of the Palestinian territories was illegal under international law, and that international law required that the occupation be brought to an end as rapidly as possible so that the Palestinian people can finally exercise their inalienable right of self-determination, including their right to a state of their own in the entirety of the Palestinian territory. In that advisory opinion last year, the court also found that although Israel is an illegal occupier, it has certain obligations under international law for the time it still remains in illegal occupation of the Palestinian territory. In particular, it's obligated by the rules of international humanitarian law and international human rights law. And that brings me to the current advisory opinion, which was issued today. Today, the court spelled out specifically what those legal obligations incumbent on Israel are as an occupying power in the Palestinian territory. In particular, under international humanitarian law, it's obligated by the Fourth Geneva Convention, of which it is a party, which, among other obligations, requires Israel to assure that the civilian population in the occupied Palestinian territory has and receives sufficient supplies of the essentials of life: humanitarian assistance, food, water, medicines, fuel, electricity, clothing, shelter, etc. This is a legal obligation that the Geneva Convention imposes on Israel throughout the Palestinian territories, but of course it is most acutely felt over the last 2 years in the Gaza Strip. So the court not only found that Israel has an obligation to ensure the delivery of adequate supplies of food and other humanitarian essentials to the civilian population in Gaza, but it found that it has failed to fulfill this obligation, because it specifically found, based on the indisputable evidence, that insufficient amounts of food and other humanitarian essentials were allowed into Gaza by Israel. And the court cited specifically the period between March and May 2025, when Israel imposed an absolutely complete blockade, which prevented the delivery of food and water and all other essentials to the civilian population in Gaza. And then it cited the evidence that since May, Israel has allowed very little food and other humanitarian assistance into Gaza, in further breach of its obligations. It's very, very serious obligations under international humanitarian law. The opinion is a very long opinion, and it will take time for us to read it carefully and digest it. But some of the other highlights were on the issue of forced displacement of the civilian population. The court found very clearly and definitively that Israel is under an obligation not to displace the civilian population. And as the entire world knows, and the court cited the indisputable evidence, on multiple occasions, Israel has forcibly displaced hundreds of thousands of civilians, of Palestinian civilians, without any legal justification. So this is a very thorough and authoritative statement, a comprehensive statement of all of the legal obligations that Israel has for as long as it continues to occupy the Palestinian territories, and particularly obligations for the protection and well-being of the civilian population. I think it's important for exposing the egregious violations that Israel has committed, including bringing about starvation and famine in Gaza, which is the exact opposite of what it is obligated to provide to the civilian population. But it is also very, very important, maybe even more so, on a forward-looking basis, because Israel remains the occupying power in Gaza and throughout the occupied Palestinian territories, and the obligations that the court articulated today continue to apply. These are obligations that not only provide the standard against which its past conduct needs to be measured, but these are obligations that exist now and on a going forward basis. And I think it's going to take a lot of effort by the international community, the United Nations and third states, to hold Israel to account, to encourage and to take actions that compel Israel to honor these obligations to the civilian population throughout the Palestinian territories, but especially in the Gaza Strip. Well, the court was very careful to limit its opinion to the circumstances that were presented to it by the General Assembly in the form of the General Assembly's request for an advisory opinion. However, that said, facts are facts, and the court determined that the facts showed that Israel pursued a policy of absolute denial of food, a deliberate policy of denying food to the civilian population to further its military aims in Gaza, and that there was a total ban on food deliveries into Gaza for between 2 and 3 months, and after that there were only limited supplies allowed in, and those limited supplies were not sufficient to prevent starvation of civilians, especially children, and famine in parts of Gaza. And so I think the fact that the International Court of Justice found those to be proven facts will most likely be used by other courts, including the International Criminal Court.